Now to Sudan, because the head of the paramilitary force accused of killing more than 100 pro-democracy protesters in that country has denied his men have done anything wrong. But the Sudanese general also promised that if a military inquiry found anyone at fault, they would be punished. Hopes of a peaceful transition of power from the military took a huge hit with the violence earlier this month. Tommy Oladipo reports now from Khartoum.
Around the city of Khartoum, you come across bricks like these, piles of them, the remnants of the weeks and weeks of protests that engulf this city. And now that's all subsided and activity is back again in the city. But the authorities have shut down the internet with the aim of keeping the protesters from mobilizing again. But that has also affected business as a whole. Over the weekend, the deputy head of the ruling military council promised that all the people who were found to be at fault for violently dispersing protesters 2 weeks ago will face justice. But the protest groups say this is not possible because it is the military who they accuse of being the ones behind the violence. Meanwhile, over the weekend, the former president Omar al-Bashir was seen for the first time in public since April when he was deposed and arrested. He faces multiple corruption charges, but there's a sense here that it'll be weeks before that trial kicks off.
Well, that's the latest from the streets there in Khartoum. Joining now from New York is the human rights activist John Prendergast. He's the co-founder of Sentry, an investigative initiative chasing the assets of African war criminals and their international collaborators. Thank you so much for being here with us on the programme. You know this country so well. You know the horrors of the Janjaweed in Darfur. What are your thoughts on those tactics being unleashed in Khartoum earlier this month?
Well, it's kind of terrifying. There's tens of thousands of militia members that are patrolling the streets of Khartoum and other urban centers. And these are not police. These are not army. These are answerable to a sort of side chain of command, a certain faction within the security services. And this faction is directly responsible for some of the most heinous human rights abuses globally since World War II. Across the world. And I think that we all should be very, very concerned about what they're capable of doing and what their agenda is.
Now, you wrote an op-ed piece in Politico, and it was titled How Congress Can Help Stop the Killing in Sudan. Just in summary terms, how can they?
Well, I think there are two missing ingredients in the policies of governments around the world that have any interest in Sudan. They really don't have they've not created any consequences for these atrocities that have been committed in Sudan. So you can create these consequences through financial measures, going after the loot, the money that these leaders have looted from the state for years, for decades. And then they need to create leverage. You know, the attempt right now is to press for a move to a civilian administration and then eventually democratic elections. But the diplomats that are streaming into Khartoum don't have any leverage. So you have to use these financial instruments, these tools of financial pressure to create that leverage to move the regime in the direction that we all hope and the protesters certainly hope.
You talk about consequences, you talk about leverage. Do you think Donald Trump understands the reasons to intervene? I mean, he's only just appointed last week his envoy to Sudan.
Yes, the United States at least has a real opportunity now because they're starting to pay attention much more directly to the crisis in Sudan. The Assistant Secretary, the top Trump official on Africa, was just there last week with the new special envoy. So they have an opportunity to mix it up a little bit. And then European governments and African governments have been seized of the matter. But again, they're not taking the kind of action necessary to create leverage to actually move the parties in Sudan towards a solution.
The money already plundered from that country, can the authorities, if they do the sort of the leverage that you want, can they get their hands on that, do you think, or is it too late now?
Sure. Most of the money that has been stolen from the oil and gold and other minerals in Sudan over the last couple of decades have been moved into the international financial system. You know, the money hasn't been reinvested in infrastructure and health and education. It's been put into the private bank accounts, into front companies, into real estate all around the world. So tracing those resources through anti-money laundering mechanisms that banks can undertake is very simply the way to go forward and find some of those assets, begin to freeze them, and begin to move those people out of the international financial system. That would create true leverage. That would force them to reconsider the kinds of policies that they've undertaken that have been so destructive for the country.
And I'm right, aren't I, that there's been a change of law in the US which enables the authorities to go after not just individuals, but whole groups that have been doing these sorts of activities we're talking about now and talking about it previously?
Well, I think that's truly the missing ingredient. You know, for years, the world has imposed sanctions individually on particular officials, sometimes middle level, and then not enforced them. What this law called the Global Magnitsky Act allows is, and the European Union is looking at a similar legislation for this, would be to impose sanctions on an entire network of people who are responsible for that looting, responsible for those human rights abuses, whether they profit from them or actually orchestrate them. Either way, that allows for a real biting consequence for the commission of the kind of atrocities that have been committed in Sudan.
Just a final quick thought in a sentence. Those people got away with it in Darfur. Are they on the brink of getting away with it again now?
If we don't act. I think we have the tools to act. We have to have the political will to do so.
John Prendergast, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us on today's programme. Thanks very much.